The morning sun filtered through the canopy as I picked my way along the rocky creek bed, following what I'd thought was a wombat trail toward higher ground. That's when I saw them, prints pressed deep into the soft mud beside the water's edge that stopped me dead in my tracks. They weren't wombat prints. I knelt down, pulling my reading glasses from my shirt pocket to get a better look. The wireframes felt warm against my nose from sitting against my chest all morning. My knees pressed into the damp earth and I could feel moisture seeping through my hiking pants. The impressions were massive, easily twice the length of my size 11 boot, with what looked like 5 distinct toe marks at the front. But it was the depth that really caught my attention. Whatever had made these tracks was heavy, much heavier than any animal I knew that moved through this part of the Blue Mountains. The print closest to me was perfectly preserved in the clay-rich soil, showing a level of detail that made my skin prickle. There were what appeared to be dermal ridges, like fingerprints but scaled up to an impossible size. The ball of the foot had pressed down so hard it had squeezed mud up around the edges. I could make out the impression of what might have been hair or coarse fur around the heel. A fly landed on my forearm and I brushed it away without taking my eyes off the track. I stood up slowly, scanning the creek bank ahead. My back cracked from the sudden movement, a reminder that I wasn't as young as I used to be. More prints led away from the water, spaced about 3 feet apart, a walking gait, not running. Whatever this thing was, it had been moving deliberately, purposefully through the bush. My first instinct was to dismiss what I was seeing. In 23 years of weekend bushwalking through every corner of the Blue Mountains, I'd seen plenty of animal tracks. Wombat, echidna, the occasional dingo print, even wild pig, sign up in the more remote areas. I'd photographed everything from fresh snake tracks in sand to the delicate impressions left by lyrebirds scratching through leaf litter. The digital images filled 3 separate folders on my computer at home, each one carefully catalogued with GPS coordinates and date stamps. But this was different. This was something that shouldn't exist. I pulled out my phone, the screen bright against the filtered morning light. My fingers felt clumsy as I navigated to the camera function. The first photo came out blurry. My hands were shaking more than I'd realized. I took several more shots, checking each one to make sure the scale was clear with my boot placed alongside for comparison. The images looked even more unsettling on the small screen. There was something almost human about the proportions, but stretched and distorted beyond anything that made sense. 23 years. That's how long I'd been exploring these mountains, ever since I'd moved to Katoomba fresh out of university. I knew every marked trail within a 50-kilometer radius, had scrambled down gorges that didn't appear on any map. I'd spent countless nights camped in valleys, where the only sounds were wind through grass trees, and the distant boom of rockfalls echoing off canyon walls. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. I'd grown up thinking I knew what lived in this country. Eastern grey kangaroos that would bound away through the scrub at the first sign of human presence. Their powerful legs could cover 10 meters in a single leap when startled. Swamp wallabies that emerged at dusk to graze in the open areas, their dark fur almost invisible against the shadows. The odd red-necked wallaby if you were lucky, smaller and more timid than their grey cousins. Wombats that left their cube-shaped droppings along every trail and wore deep paths through the undergrowth with decades of nightly wanderings. But nothing that could leave tracks like these. I followed the prints with my eyes as they disappeared into a stand of mountain ash and tree ferns about 50 meters upstream. The spacing was consistent, the depth uniform. This wasn't some hoax or misidentification. Something large and bipedal had walked through here, probably within the last day or two, given how crisp the impressions were. My mind raced through possibilities I didn't want to consider. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every serious bushwalker in the Blue Mountains had heard whispered tales around campfires, sightings of something that walked upright through the deep forest. Something that left tracks too big to be human and too human to be anything else. The old Aboriginal stories spoke of hairy man-creatures that lived in the most remote parts of the mountains. Beings that were best left undisturbed. I'd always filed those stories alongside drop bear warnings and tales of phantom hitchhikers. Entertaining bush folklore that added a bit of mystery to long hiking days, but nothing more substantial than campfire ghost stories. I was a practical man, a retired high school science teacher who believed in evidence and rational explanations. My students used to joke that I could make anything sound boring with enough facts and measurements. But the evidence was right there in the mud in front of me, challenging everything I thought I knew about the wildlife in these mountains. I crouched down again, this time placing my hand next to the clearest print. The mud felt cool and slightly sticky against my palm. My hand covered maybe half the width of the impression. The toes, if that's what they were, showed clear nail or claw marks at the tips. But not the sharp, pointed impressions you'd expect from a large predator. These were more like thick, blunt human fingernails, only scaled up to an impossible size. The thought sent a shiver down my spine despite the warming morning air. A kookaburra called from somewhere upstream, its familiar laugh echoing off the valley walls. The sound was reassuring, a connection to the normal world of Australian bush that I understood. I'd been bushwalking solo for over 2 decades, had camped alone in valleys so remote that helicopters were the only way in or out. I'd never felt genuinely unnerved by the Australian bush, cautious, yes, especially around cliff edges and loose rock. But never frightened by the possibility of what might be sharing the forest with me. Until now. Standing up, I brushed the mud from my knees and looked around the clearing with new eyes. The creek gurgled past, indifferent to my discovery. Water striders skated across the surface of a quiet pool near my feet, their legs dimpling the surface tension. A whipbird called from somewhere upstream, its sharp crack echoing off the valley walls. Everything seemed normal, exactly as it should be, in a healthy patch of temperate rainforest. The morning air carried the clean scent of eucalyptus, and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. Except for the impossible tracks leading away into the ferns. I checked my GPS unit out of habit, squinting at the small screen, still 3 kilometers from the nearest fire trail, well within familiar territory. The coordinates matched exactly with my planned route. I'd intended a simple day walk, following Jameson Creek up to its headwaters, before looping back through the casuarina groves toward the car park. An easy 8-kilometer circuit that I'd completed dozens of times over the years. The kind of relaxing solo hike that cleared my head and recharged my batteries after a week in the city. But those tracks were calling into question everything I thought I knew about this place I'd been exploring for more than half my adult life. In all those years, through all those kilometers of bush trails and off-track scrambles, I'd never seen anything that couldn't be easily explained and categorized. I maintained detailed hiking logs at home, filled with notes about flora and fauna observations. Every unusual sighting got researched and properly identified when I returned to civilization. Now, faced with evidence that something large and unknown was moving through country I considered my backyard, I felt like a tourist again. Uncertain, out of my depth, suddenly aware of how much forest stretched away in every direction beyond the narrow corridors of marked walking tracks. The rational part of my mind was already working on explanations. Maybe it was some kind of deformity, a kangaroo with a genetic abnormality affecting its gait and foot structure. Or perhaps an escaped animal from a private collection, something exotic that had been living wild in the mountains for months or years without detection. A wealthy collector's illegal pet, grown too large and dangerous to contain. But even as I tried to construct logical alternatives, I knew I was grasping at straws. The prints were too clear, too consistent, too obviously made by something that moved through the forest with purpose and intelligence, something that, according to everything I knew about Australian wildlife, simply couldn't exist. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct I'd developed over 20 years of solo bushwalking was telling me to mark the GPS coordinates, take some photos, and head back to the car park. This was the kind of discovery that belonged in the hands of wildlife authorities or university researchers, not a middle-aged retired teacher with a hiking hobby. But even as I told myself this, I was already studying the line of tracks leading away from the creek. My eyes followed them as they disappeared between the massive tree ferns. I found myself trying to determine which direction the creature had been traveling. The prints continued upstream, spaced roughly 2 meters apart in an easy loping stride. Whatever had made them wasn't in any hurry. There were no gouges in the earth to suggest panic or pursuit, no skid marks where it had changed direction suddenly. The stride was confident, purposeful, following the easiest route through the understory, like something intimately familiar with this terrain. I found myself taking a step forward, then another, my hiking boots squelched slightly in the soft creekside mud. My eyes locked on the next clear impression in the soft earth beside a fallen tree. Just a little way, I told myself. Just far enough to get a better sense of where it was heading, maybe find some other clue about what kind of animal could leave such distinctive marks. I had my camera in my pack. Proper documentation would be useful regardless of what explanation eventually emerged, and I was curious, more than curious, if I was being honest. In all my years of hiking, I'd never encountered anything that genuinely challenged my understanding of the local ecosystem. This felt like the kind of mystery that comes along once in a lifetime. Walking away without investigation seemed like cowardice. The tracks led me away from the creek, following what might once have been an animal path through a grove of tree ferns. Here the prints were less distinct, visible mainly as compressed vegetation, and the occasional partial impression in patches of moss. The soft green carpet showed clear signs of disturbance where something heavy had passed. Individual fronds were bent and broken, their delicate structure crushed by enormous weight. But the creature's passage was still obvious in other ways. Broken fronds hanging at odd angles, their stems snapped but still partially attached. Disturbed leaf litter pushed aside in regular patterns. Small branches pushed aside rather than stepped over, bent but not broken. I found myself developing a sense for reading the subtle signs, anticipating where the next clear track would appear. My breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of uphill walking. The forest around me was awakening to full morning activity. Honeyeaters called from the canopy overhead, their liquid notes cascading down through the filtered light. The air grew warmer as the quastus kafia, bitosescri sun climbed higher, though the thick canopy kept me in comfortable shade. 20 minutes upstream from my original discovery, I checked my GPS again. The small screen showed I'd traveled almost a kilometer from the original prints, still within the bounds of the national park, but definitely off the marked trail system now. The creek had narrowed to a series of rocky pools connected by small waterfalls. Each cascade was only a meter or two high, but the sound of falling water created a constant background murmur. The vegetation was changing as the valley sides steepened. Less grass tree and more temperate rainforest species, sassafras, coachwood, the occasional red cedar. The massive trunk spoke of centuries undisturbed by fire or logging. Some of these trees had been growing when the first European settlers arrived in the colony. The canopy was thicker here, filtering the morning sunlight into a greenish twilight that made everything seem hushed and primeval. Bird calls sounded different here, muffled and distant. Even my footsteps seemed to be absorbed by the dense undergrowth. The tracks were leading me uphill now, following a ridgeline that climbed steadily away from the water. This was country I knew existed but had never explored. The kind of steep, densely vegetated terrain that required serious commitment to penetrate. My topographic maps showed it as closely spaced contour lines and green shading that indicated dense forest. My planned circuit hike was a distant memory. I was deep into unscheduled territory, following something that left footprints like a giant man through country that grew wilder with every step. The air was cooler here, carrying scents I couldn't identify. Rich, earthy smells that spoke of deep soil and ancient growth. I should have been keeping better track of time, should have been paying more attention to my route for the return journey. Instead, I found myself increasingly absorbed by the puzzle of the creature's path. It seemed to know exactly where it was going, taking routes that avoided the thickest scrub and steepest climbs, while still maintaining a generally eastward direction. Several times I lost the trail entirely, only to pick it up again 50 meters further on. The creature had emerged from dense undergrowth that would have been nearly impassable for a human. Walls of lantana and native raspberry that formed almost impenetrable barriers. Yet somehow it had pushed through without leaving obvious damage to the vegetation. By midday I realized I'd been following the tracks for over 3 hours. My water bottle was half empty, and I'd eaten both the energy bars I'd packed for what was supposed to be a short day walk. The peanut butter and oats sat heavy in my stomach, no longer providing the quick energy I needed. More concerning, my GPS unit was showing only 2 bars of satellite reception. The thick canopy and steep terrain were interfering with the signal. My mobile phone had lost signal completely somewhere in the last hour. The screen showed no service, in stark letters. The ridgeline had led me into a maze of steep-sided gullies and knife-edge spurs. The kind of complex terrain where getting lost was a real possibility, even with modern navigation equipment. Each fold in the landscape looked identical to the last. Ancient trees and thick undergrowth created walls that blocked any view of distant landmarks. but the tracks kept drawing me forward. They were clearer now on the softer ground of the ridgetop, and I was starting to notice details that made the creature seem even more mysterious. The toes showed remarkable flexibility, gripping and releasing the earth in a way that suggested an almost human-like ability to feel the terrain underfoot. In soft patches, I could see where individual toes had spread for better grip on steep sections. There were places where it had stepped carefully around loose rocks, or adjusted its stride to avoid a boggy patch. Evidence of planning and consideration that went beyond simple animal instinct. The spacing between prints varied with the terrain, shortening on steep sections, and lengthening on flat ground. This was adaptive behavior, intelligence responding to changing conditions. The forest was changing around me too, becoming older and more untouched than any country I'd explored in the Blue Mountains. Some of the trees were massive, red cedars that must have predated European settlement, their buttressed trunks rising like cathedral columns into the canopy. The bark was deeply furrowed, scarred by centuries of weather and insect damage. Strangler figs had wrapped around some of the older trees, their rope-like vines creating natural ladders into the canopy. The understory was relatively open beneath them, carpeted with ferns and dotted with the occasional cycad. Ancient plants that had survived from the age of dinosaurs, their fronds perfectly preserved in the still air. It felt ancient in a way that made me acutely aware of being an intruder, a temporary visitor in something much larger and more permanent than myself. The silence was different here too, not the complete absence of sound, but the hushed quality of a natural cathedral. Even the wind seemed muffled by the dense vegetation. When I finally stopped to take proper stock of my situation, the sun was already past its zenith. I could tell from the angle of light filtering through the canopy that it was well past 1 o'clock. According to my GPS, I was nearly 6 kilometers from the car park, most of that distance through unmarked forest that would be difficult to navigate even in daylight. The terrain between here and familiar territory was a maze of ridges and gullies. Any mistake in navigation could easily add hours to an already challenging return journey. The smart thing would be to turn around immediately, try to retrace my route while I still had enough daylight to safely find my way back to familiar territory. I had maybe 5 hours before sunset, 6 at the outside. But the tracks were leading toward what looked like a saddle between two peaks. I could see glimpses of clearer ground ahead through the trees. Just a little further, I told myself. Just to the top of the rise, where I might get better GPS reception and a clearer view of the surrounding country. Then I'd turn back, satisfied that I'd followed the mystery as far as prudence allowed. The creature had paused at the saddle. I could tell from the way the tracks clustered and overlapped. Multiple prints in a small area, as if it had stopped to survey the territory ahead. Some impressions were deeper than others, suggesting it had shifted its weight while standing still. Standing in the same spot, I understood why. The ground fell away into a valley I'd never seen before, a deep bowl of forest that seemed to exist in its own private world. Ancient trees covered the slopes like a green carpet, broken only by the silver thread of a creek winding across the valley floor. It was beautiful and completely wild, the kind of country that might never have felt a human footprint. The air was so clear I could make out individual tree crowns kilometers away. No power lines, no roads, no buildings, just unbroken wilderness stretching to the horizon. And leading down into it, clear as a highway in the soft earth, the tracks continued. Whatever had made them was heading directly toward the heart of that untouched valley. Following what looked like a well-established route through country that my topographic maps showed as blank space between contour lines. I checked my watch, calculated distances and walking times. Tried to convince myself that following the tracks any further would be madness. The return journey was already going to be challenging. Adding more distance and difficult terrain could easily turn a day walk into an emergency. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, looking down into a valley that seemed to exist outside the normal world, I knew I was already committed. The creature that made those tracks was down there somewhere, in country so remote that I might be the first human to ever look upon it. The rational, safety-conscious bushwalker in me was screaming warnings, but they were being drowned out by something stronger, a compulsion that felt almost magnetic, pulling me down into the unknown forest where answers waited in the gathering shadows. The descent into the valley proved treacherous, the slope steeper than it had appeared from the ridge. Loose stones shifted under my feet with each step, threatening to send me tumbling down the mountainside. I picked my way carefully between moss-covered boulders and fallen logs, using my hands to steady myself on the rougher sections. My hiking poles would have been useful here, but I'd left them in the car for what I'd planned as an easy creek walk. Following the creature's trail as it wound down through increasingly dense forest, the tracks were easier to read here in the soft, leaf litter, each footprint pressed deep into the accumulated mulch of countless seasons. The rich, loamy smell rose up with each disturbed step, but it wasn't just the footprints that marked the creature's passage. 20 meters down the slope, I encountered the first broken branch. A thick eucalyptus limb snapped clean through at roughly my shoulder height. The break was fresh, sap still weeping from the splintered wood in clear amber drops. I touched the sticky residue with my fingertip and it came away wet. It would have taken considerable force to snap something that substantial. I examined the break carefully, noting how the wood had been twisted as well as snapped, as if grabbed and wrenched aside rather than simply walked into. No animal I knew moved through the bush like that. Kangaroos and wallabies flowed around obstacles. Even large wombats pushed through undergrowth rather than breaking it. Further down, more signs of disturbance became apparent. Saplings bent double and left hanging at unnatural angles, their trunks creased but not broken. As if something had pushed through, without regard for what lay in its path. The young trees looked tortured, their natural growth patterns interrupted by massive force. Bark scraped from tree trunks at heights that made me crane my neck to examine the damage. Long gouges in the soft wood that could have been claw marks, though far larger than anything I'd seen from wombats or echidnas. The scratches were deep, cutting through the outer bark into the living cambium beneath. White wood showed bright against the darker outer layers. The most disturbing discovery came halfway down the slope, where the creature's trail passed between two large ironbark trees. Both trunks bore deep scratches at a height well above my head. I had to stretch my arms up fully to touch the lowest marks. Parallel grooves carved into the hard wood with enough force to leave curled shavings scattered on the ground below. I picked up one of the larger pieces, noting how the wood had been compressed and torn rather than cut cleanly. The shaving was thick and substantial, torn from the tree with brute force. Whatever had made these marks possessed both size and strength that challenged every assumption I held about Australian wildlife. My hands were beginning to shake slightly as the implications sank in. The air grew cooler as I descended, the canopy thickening overhead until only scattered patches of sunlight reached the forest floor. Ancient trees towered around me, their trunks massive and moss-covered, speaking of centuries undisturbed by fire or human interference. This was old-growth forest of a type that barely existed anymore, a remnant of the continent, as it had been before European settlement. Some of these trees were enormous, red cedars with trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. Their bark was deeply furrowed, providing handholds where vines and epiphytes had taken root. The silence was different. Here too. Not the complete quiet of a dead place, but the hushed atmosphere of a natural cathedral, where even my careful footsteps seemed intrusive. The sound of my own breathing was unnaturally loud in the stillness. Each step on the soft leaf litter created small rustling sounds that seemed to echo in the dense air. The creature's tracks led me toward the sound of running water, and I eventually found the creek I'd spotted from the ridge. It was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 3 meters wide and running clear over a bed of smooth stones. The water was crystal clear, so transparent I could count individual pebbles on the bottom. Small fish darted between the rocks, their silver scales flashing in the filtered sunlight. The tracks approached the water's edge and then simply vanished. I spent 20 minutes searching both banks, looking for any sign of where the trail continued, but found nothing. The soft mud along the creek bank was unmarked, except for the prints leading directly to the water. Whatever had made those massive footprints had either waded upstream or downstream, or possessed the ability to cross the creek without leaving any trace on the opposite bank. The water was moving fast enough to have erased any prints from the stream itself. I knelt beside the water and cupped some in my hands, tasting it cautiously. It was clean and cold, with the mineral taste of water filtered through granite. My water bottle was nearly empty, so I refilled it using purification tablets. The chemical taste would be unpleasant, but safer than risking contamination from unknown sources. As I stood beside the water trying to decide which direction to search, I heard the first sound that didn't belong. A deep, resonant call echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something that combined elements of both. The sound raised the hair on my arms and sent an instinctive chill down my spine. I'd heard plenty of wildlife calls in my 20 years of bushwalking. From the haunting cry of a lyrebird to the territorial roar of a bull koala. But this was something entirely different. It had a quality that spoke of size and intelligence. A vocalization that seemed almost deliberately crafted to inspire unease. The call seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the valley walls until I couldn't determine its source. The sound faded into the forest silence, leaving me straining to hear any response or repetition. Instead, I became aware of other sounds that hadn't registered before. Subtle disturbances in the natural rhythm of the bush. The snap of a distant branch, sharp and sudden in the still air. The rustle of vegetation being pushed aside, too rhythmic to be wind. Sounds that suggested movement, though whether from wind or something more substantial I couldn't determine. I glanced at my watch and felt the first real stab of concern. It was already past 4 o'clock, and the light filtering through the canopy had taken on the golden quality that preceded evening. The shadows were growing longer, and the air temperature was beginning to drop. I'd been following the tracks for over 6 hours, moving steadily away from any marked trail or recognizable landmark. My GPS showed my position as a small dot in a vast area of green, kilometers from the nearest road or walking track. Even if I started back immediately, I'd be navigating unfamiliar forest in darkness, a prospect that filled me with growing unease. I had a headlamp in my pack, but night navigation through this terrain would be treacherous at best. But turning back meant abandoning the trail, leaving the mystery unsolved just when the evidence suggested I was getting closer to answers. The fresh breaks in the vegetation, the deep claw marks on the trees, the strange call echoing through the forest. Everything pointed to an active presence somewhere nearby. I'd come too far, and invested too much to simply retreat now. As if responding to my internal debate, another call drifted through the trees. Closer this time and from a different direction. The sound seemed to come from upstream along the creek, then another, from somewhere downstream. The sounds weren't random, they had the structured quality of communication, as if multiple creatures were coordinating their movements through the forest. The realization sent a cold thrill through my chest. I wasn't tracking a single animal anymore, I was surrounded by them. The rational part of my mind was cataloging escape routes and calculating distances to safety, but my feet remained planted beside the creek, as if rooted to the spot. Some deeper instinct was keeping me motionless, perhaps recognizing that sudden movement might trigger a response I wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, I listened to the forest around me, trying to map the locations of the calls and determine how many creatures might be out there in the darkening bush. The sounds were forming a pattern now, calls moving through the forest in what seemed like a deliberate circuit around my position. Whatever was making them knew exactly where I was and had me effectively surrounded. As the last of the afternoon light began fading from the canopy overhead, I realized that the decision about whether to continue or retreat had been taken out of my hands entirely. The calls continued well into twilight, a methodical pattern of communication that never approached close enough to reveal its source. But never moved far enough away to offer comfort. Each call seemed to be answered by another from a different direction. A conversation in a language I couldn't understand, but whose intent seemed clear. By the time full darkness settled over the forest, I had accepted the grim reality that I would be spending the night here. Surrounded by creatures whose intentions remained completely unknown, my emergency gear was limited, a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, and minimal supplies. I'd packed for a day walk, not an overnight expedition. Finding a suitable campsite in the dark proved nearly impossible. The dense canopy blocked what little moonlight filtered through the clouds, leaving me dependent on my torch to navigate between the massive tree trunks and tangled undergrowth. The LED beam created a small circle of harsh white light, but seemed to make the surrounding darkness even more impenetrable. Eventually I located a small clearing beside the creek where fallen logs formed a rough semicircle, providing some protection for my back while giving me clear sightlines across the water. The ground was relatively flat and clear of major rocks or roots. I set up my lightweight tent with practiced efficiency, though my hands shook more than usual as I drove in the stakes. The familiar ritual was comforting. but every few minutes I would pause and listen, sweeping my torch beam across the surrounding forest. The calls had stopped shortly after darkness fell, but the sudden silence was somehow worse than the coordinated sounds had been. At least when they were calling, I knew approximately where they were. My emergency supplies were limited, a few energy bars, some dried fruit, and barely enough water for the night. I'd planned to refill my bottles at the creek, but the thought of kneeling exposed at the water's edge made my skin crawl. The sound of running water was constant, but it could easily mask the approach of something moving along the creek bank. Instead, I rationed what I had and tried to convince myself that dehydration was the least of my concerns. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from the forest, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of something moving through the creek, sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed, boots still on, torch gripped in one hand and my emergency whistle in the other. Though I doubted either would do much good if something decided to investigate my camp more closely. The sleeping bag felt confining rather than comfortable. I kept the zipper only halfway closed, ready to exit quickly if necessary. My heart rate wouldn't settle into a normal rhythm. Around midnight the sounds began. At first it was just the snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness beyond my clearing, a sharp crack that could have been natural settling or something else entirely. Then the soft pad of footsteps moving through the undergrowth, circling my position at a distance of perhaps 30 meters. Whatever was out there was making no effort to move silently. In fact, it seemed to want me to know it was there, maintaining just enough noise to track its movement around the perimeter of my camp. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested bipedal locomotion, not the four-legged gait of a large kangaroo or the shuffling movement of a wombat, but the measured stride of something walking upright through the forest. The pattern was hypnotic in its regularity. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. As if the creature was stopping periodically to observe my camp before continuing its circuit. I could hear branches being pushed aside, the soft swish of vegetation being displaced by something large. Sometimes a small rock would be dislodged, clicking against other stones as it rolled down the slope. I pressed my face to the mesh window of my tent, torch ready but not yet switched on. The darkness beyond the clearing was absolute, a wall of black that could have hidden a dozen creatures without revealing so much as a silhouette. But I could hear it out there, patient and persistent, maintaining its vigil around my campsite like a predator assessing its prey. The circling continued for over an hour, gradually moving closer with each circuit. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct. I could hear the soft squelch of mud being compressed under enormous weight, the rustle of ferns being brushed aside, until the footsteps seemed to be coming from just beyond the ring of fallen logs that bordered my clearing. At one point I was certain I heard breathing. Deep, measured inhalations that definitely didn't come from any animal I could identify. The sound was rhythmic and controlled, but with an underlying power that spoke of enormous lung capacity. The sound raised every hair on my arms and made my throat constrict with primitive fear. My mouth went dry, and I had to consciously control my own breathing to keep from hyperventilating. Then, sometime after 2 a.m., everything went quiet again. The footsteps stopped, the breathing ceased, and the forest returned to its normal nighttime symphony of insects and distant bird calls. But I knew whatever had been circling my camp hadn't left. It was still out there, watching and waiting, simply no longer announcing its presence. The silence was more unnerving than the sounds had been. I must have dozed fitfully toward dawn, because I was startled awake by the sound of my own tent zipper being slowly drawn upward. For a heart-stopping moment I thought something was trying to get inside, until I realized the sound was coming from the wrong direction. Someone, or something, was opening my tent from the outside, but not where the entrance should be. The sound was coming from the side wall, near my feet. I grabbed my torch and switched it on, illuminating the interior of my tent in harsh white light. Everything appeared normal. The orange fabric walls glowed in the LED beam, showing no tears or intrusions. The zipper on the entrance was still securely closed, exactly as I'd left it. But the sound had been unmistakable. The distinctive metallic whisper of a zipper being worked by something unfamiliar with its mechanism. Pausing and starting again, as if puzzled by its function. The sound stopped when my torch came on, as if whatever was manipulating the zipper had been startled by the sudden light. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the entrance and peer outside, the dawn light revealed my campsite transformed. My backpack, which I had left securely positioned beside the tent's entrance, now sat on the opposite side of the clearing near the creek's edge. The buckles were undone and several items had been removed, arranged in a rough line across one of the fallen logs. My first aid kit, water purification tablets, emergency flare, and compass, laid out as if for inspection. Each item was positioned precisely, aligned with the others in a way that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random scattering. Most disturbing was what had happened to my food supplies. The energy bars had been unwrapped but not eaten, each one broken in half, and the pieces arranged in pairs. The wrappers were folded neatly beside each pair, creased with sharp precision. The dried fruit had been sorted by type and color, creating small, precise piles that showed an attention to detail that no wild animal should possess. Apricots in one pile, dates in another, banana chips arranged in a perfect circle. It was the work of something with opposable thumbs and enough intelligence to categorize objects according to some unknown criteria. Around the perimeter of the clearing, pressed deep into the soft earth beside the creek, were dozens of fresh footprints. They were identical to the tracks I'd been following, elongated, with pronounced toe marks, and the deep heel impression that had first caught my attention on the trail. But these prints formed patterns around my campsite that suggested prolonged observation. Some were positioned directly beside my tent, close enough that the creature making them could have reached out and touched the fabric while I slept. The mud around the prints was still damp, indicating they were very fresh, made within the last few hours while I dozed fitfully in my sleeping bag. Most unsettling were the handprints. Scattered among the footprints were the clear impressions of large hands, with long, articulated fingers that had pressed into the mud along the creek bank. The prints were definitely primate in structure, but far larger than any human hand, with proportions that suggested immense strength. Several were positioned as if the creature had knelt beside the water, perhaps drinking, or simply studying its own reflection in the pre-dawn darkness. I knelt beside one of the clearest handprints, placing my own hand next to it for comparison. My fingers barely reached the first knuckle joints of the creature's digits. The palm was wide and powerful, with deep creases that spoke of flexibility and dexterity. I packed my rearranged gear with shaking hands, checking repeatedly over my shoulder for any sign of movement in the surrounding forest. Everything was still and quiet now, but the evidence of the night's visitation was undeniable. Something large and intelligent had spent hours investigating my camp, handling my equipment with curious precision, and studying me while I lay helpless in my tent. The realization that I had been completely at its mercy throughout the night sent waves of retrospective terror through my system. My hands fumbled with the buckles on my pack, muscle memory compromised by adrenaline and fear. As I shouldered my backpack and prepared to leave the clearing, I noticed one final detail that nearly made my knees buckle. Pressed into the soft earth directly beside where my head had rested against the tent wall was a single, perfect handprint. The creature had knelt beside my tent and placed its hand against the ground mere inches from where I'd been sleeping. Close enough to hear my breathing, perhaps even to sense my dreams. The print was still slightly damp from the morning dew, the edges sharp and clearly defined. 5 long fingers, and an opposable thumb, proportioned like a human hand but scaled up to impossible dimensions. It was the hand of something that walked upright through the forest. Something intelligent enough to investigate human artifacts and patient enough to spend an entire night studying a sleeping intruder in its territory. As I stared down at that handprint beside my collapsed tent, I finally understood that I was no longer the tracker in this relationship. I had become the tracked, and whatever had been observing me through the night was still out there in the forest, watching and waiting to see what I would do next. The immediate need to escape overwhelmed any remaining scientific curiosity about the creature that had spent the night studying me. I broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into my pack without the usual care for organization. My sleeping bag went in compressed but not properly rolled. The tent poles clinked together as I shoved them into their stuff sack. The handprint beside where my head had rested seemed to burn into my peripheral vision no matter which direction I turned. A constant reminder that something massive and intelligent considered me an object of interest in its territory. My hands trembled as I consulted the GPS unit, desperate for the familiar comfort of technology and navigation. The small screen showed my position as a blinking dot surrounded by green wilderness, but the reassuring network of trails I'd expected to see was disturbingly sparse. According to the device, I was roughly 15 kilometers from the main walking track. much further than I'd estimated during yesterday's pursuit of the footprints. The direct route back cut through some of the densest forest in the area, terrain I'd avoided in 20 years of bushwalking because of its reputation for being nearly impassable. But I had no choice. Every instinct screamed at me to put distance between myself and this clearing as quickly as possible. The creature might return, and next time it might not be content with simple observation. I oriented myself toward the northeast, where the GPS indicated the closest established trail, and pushed through the ring of ancient trees that surrounded my campsite. Within minutes I realized something was fundamentally wrong. The landscape I'd traversed yesterday in pursuit of the tracks had somehow transformed overnight. Dense scrub blocked what should have been relatively open forest floor. Walls of lantana and native raspberry that I didn't remember encountering before. Massive fallen trees created barriers that forced lengthy detours. Their trunks so recently toppled that the leaves still carried morning dew. Yet the breaks in their bark looked weathered, as if they'd been down for years. The contradiction made no sense but was impossible to ignore. I pushed through a thicket that hadn't existed during yesterday's journey, branches catching at my clothing and pack. Thorns tore at my sleeves and left thin scratches along my arms that began to sting with perspiration. The undergrowth seemed deliberately obstructive, as if the forest was actively resisting my passage. When I emerged on the other side, breathing heavily, I found myself in a small clearing that felt familiar yet completely wrong. The same type of eucalyptus trees surrounded me, the same granite outcropping rose from the center. But everything was arranged differently, as if someone had taken a photograph and subtly rearranged all the elements. The fallen log was on the wrong side of the clearing. The creek bent in the opposite direction from what I remembered. My compass showed I was still heading northeast, but nothing matched my memory of the terrain. The creek bed I'd followed for hours yesterday was nowhere to be found. Instead, I encountered steep ridges and deep gullies that should have been visible on my topographic maps, but appeared as blank green spaces on both paper and GPS. The forest seemed to be actively working against my escape, presenting obstacles that defied the natural geography of the region. Hours passed in increasingly desperate navigation attempts. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward afternoon, throwing different shadows that made familiar tree shapes look alien and threatening. Every eucalyptus began to look identical, their mottled bark and graceful branches blending into a monotonous maze. My water was running low despite careful rationing. The purification tablets had left an unpleasant chemical aftertaste that made each sip less refreshing. And the protein bars in my pack had dwindled to 2 remaining packages. Each time I thought I'd found a path leading toward civilization, it would peter out into impenetrable scrub, or end at the base of cliff faces that hadn't existed on any of my survey maps. Sheer rock walls rising 30 meters or more, blocking any further progress in that direction. The worst realization came when I climbed a tall ridgeline, expecting to see the distant blue line of the main highway that bordered the national park. Instead, the forest canopy stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. An endless sea of green punctuated only by the occasional rocky outcrop. I was looking at wilderness that extended far beyond the boundaries of any protected area I knew. As if the forest had grown while I wasn't watching, consuming roads and towns and spreading its ancient influence across the entire landscape. Panic began to set in properly then, a cold knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. I was genuinely lost in a way that shouldn't have been possible in this region, where civilization was never more than a day's walk in any direction. Yet here I was, surrounded by primordial forest that seemed to have swallowed all evidence of the modern world. The GPS showed my position but offered no helpful suggestions for routes out, its cheerful electronic certainty useless against the reality of impassable terrain. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, I found myself moving more carefully, conscious that something was watching my increasingly frantic attempts at navigation. The forest was too quiet, lacking the normal sounds of bird calls and insect activity. Instead, there was only the soft whisper of wind through ancient branches and the occasional crack of settling timber. But underneath those natural sounds, I began to detect something else, the subtle displacement of undergrowth, the soft pad of footsteps matching my own pace. I wasn't alone out here. The creature that had investigated my camp was following my escape attempt, staying just out of sight but close enough that I occasionally caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Large shapes shifting between tree trunks, always gone when I turned for a direct look. The knowledge that I was being tracked sent adrenaline coursing through my system. But it also brought a strange sense of inevitability. Whatever this thing was, it clearly knew the forest far better than I did. It was herding me, guiding my increasingly desperate wandering toward some predetermined destination. The confrontation came at sunset, in a grove of massive mountain ash trees, whose trunks rose like cathedral pillars toward the canopy. I'd been following what appeared to be a game trail when I suddenly realized the path had led me in a complete circle, ending exactly where I'd started an hour earlier. The same fallen log, the same distinctive cluster of tree ferns, the same granite boulder, marked with lichen patterns I'd photographed during my first pass through the grove. I stopped in the center of the clearing, no longer pretending I didn't know I was being watched. The forest around me held that peculiar stillness that comes just before a storm. As if every living thing was holding its breath, in anticipation. My hands shook as I set down my pack and turned slowly, scanning the ring of massive trees for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. The creature stepped out from behind a tree trunk, so casually that for a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It had been there all along, probably watching my circular journey with what might have been amusement. If such emotions could be attributed to something so alien. Standing upright on two legs, it towered nearly 9 feet tall, its body covered in coarse dark hair that seemed to absorb the failing light. The proportions were almost human, but scaled up to impossible dimensions, with shoulders broad enough to span a doorway and arms that hung past its knees. Its face was the most unsettling feature, combining ape-like characteristics with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. Deep-set eyes studied me with frank curiosity, showing no fear or aggression. Only the patient interest of a superior predator examining something that had wandered into its territory. This was the source of the massive footprints, the midnight investigator of my camp. The presence that had been guiding my futile escape attempts through terrain it knew intimately. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. The creature seemed content to let me absorb the reality of its existence, perhaps understanding that my worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. Every rational explanation I'd constructed for the strange tracks and disturbed vegetation crumbled in the face of this living contradiction. To everything I thought I knew about Australian wildlife. This was the Yowie of Aboriginal legend, the creature that bushwalkers whispered about around campfires before dismissing with nervous laughter. Except there was nothing mythical about the being standing 20 feet away from me, studying my face with eyes that held an intelligence far older than human civilization. I remained frozen as the creature regarded me with that unsettling patience, neither of us breaking the strange detente that had settled over the clearing. Then, without warning, it moved, not toward me, but to one side, stepping with surprising grace for something so massive. Its gait was fluid and purposeful as it walked to the edge of the clearing. Where a young eucalyptus had been damaged by recent storms, its trunk split but still standing. The Yowie placed one enormous hand against the wounded tree and pushed. The trunk gave way, with a sharp crack that echoed through the forest. But instead of letting it crash to the ground, the creature caught the falling timber with both hands, and began to manipulate it with deliberate precision. Using strength that defied comprehension, it stripped away branches and bark, until only the clean heartwood remained, then positioned the makeshift pole between two healthy trees. What followed challenged every assumption I'd held about animal intelligence. The creature gathered stones from around the clearing, not randomly but with clear selection criteria, only smooth river rocks of similar size. These it arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around the base of the pole, creating a formation that spoke of mathematical understanding and aesthetic sensibility. The precision was remarkable, each stone placed with consideration for spacing and visual balance. But it wasn't finished. Moving to another section of the clearing, the Yowie began collecting specific plants, not grabbing randomly at vegetation, but selecting particular ferns and native grasses, with the discrimination of someone who understood their properties. Some leaves it crushed between massive fingers, releasing aromatic oils that filled the air with complex fragrances I couldn't identify. Others it wove together with a dexterity that seemed impossible, given the size of its hands, creating intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as Aboriginal string figures I'd seen in museums. Throughout this entire demonstration, the creature, periodically glanced in my direction, as if gauging my comprehension. Those dark eyes held an expectation that was both alien and familiar. The same look a teacher might give a particularly slow student. It was clear that this display was intended for my benefit, a lesson being delivered in a language I was only beginning to understand. The Yowie moved to yet another area of the clearing and began to construct what could only be described as a map. Using sticks, stones, and compressed earth, it recreated the topography of the surrounding forest with stunning accuracy. I recognized landmarks: the granite outcrop where I'd first lost the trail, the creek bed I'd crossed multiple times, even the ridgeline visible from my original hiking route. But the creature's version included details no human map contained: secret paths winding through seemingly impassable scrub, hidden water sources, cave systems that honeycombed the valley walls. As I watched, transfixed, the Yowie used a claw to trace routes through its terrain model. These weren't random scratches but deliberate pathways that revealed the forest's hidden architecture. It showed me where the real trails ran, not the maintained bushwalking tracks that followed contour lines and avoided obstacles, but ancient routes that followed water sources and natural boundaries established long before European settlement. The demonstration continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The creature showed me how to read the forest itself, which trees indicated underground water, how to recognize territorial markings left by various animals, the subtle signs that revealed safe camping spots versus areas best avoided. This wasn't instinctual behavior. It was accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. A sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that rivaled anything taught in university forestry programs. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lesson ended. The Yowie straightened to its full imposing height and fixed me with that penetrating stare. For the first time since our encounter began, I sensed a shift in its demeanor. The patient teacher had become something more serious, more threatening. When it moved toward me, I had to fight every instinct screaming at me to run. It stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that I could smell its musky, earthy odor and see the intelligence burning in those ancient eyes. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive hand and pointed toward the eastern edge of the clearing. The meaning was unmistakable. That way led out of its territory and back to the human world where I belonged. But the gesture carried weight beyond simple direction-giving. There was warning in it, a clear message that this encounter represented both privilege and ultimatum. I had been granted audience with something that most humans would never see, allowed to witness knowledge that predated recorded history. The gift came with conditions: respect for boundaries that existed beyond any government map, acknowledgement of claims that superseded legal deeds and survey markers. Without breaking eye contact, the Yowie began to move backward toward the tree line. Each step was measured, deliberate, giving me opportunity to memorize its form and movement. This wasn't retreat, it was controlled withdrawal. The behavior of something confident in its superiority, but choosing to disengage on its own terms. As it reached the edge of the clearing, where ancient trees created walls of shadow, the creature paused one final time. It tilted its massive head slightly, and I could have sworn I detected something almost like curiosity in its expression. As if wondering what I would make of this encounter when I returned to civilization. Then it stepped backward into the forest and simply vanished. The thick undergrowth swallowed it completely, leaving no trace of its passage. I stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by evidence of what had just occurred. The stone spiral remained perfectly arranged, the woven plant materials still released their complex fragrances, and the topographical map lay intact in the compressed earth. Yet even as I stared at these tangible proofs, part of my mind struggled to accept the reality of what I'd witnessed. Moving carefully to the spot where the Yowie had pointed, I discovered what I'd somehow missed during my panicked wanderings: a clear path leading eastward through the forest. Not the game trail I'd been following earlier, but an actual route marked by subtle signs: broken branches at eye level, disturbed leaf litter, stones arranged in patterns that created navigation markers. For anyone who knew how to read them, the creature had led me here, not as predator herding prey, but as host escorting an unwelcome guest to the boundary of its domain. Everything that had happened, my circular wandering, the mysterious rearrangement of familiar landmarks, even the unsettling presence I'd felt throughout the night, had been carefully orchestrated. to bring me to this moment of revelation and dismissal. I shouldered my pack with hands that still trembled slightly, and began following the path eastward. Behind me, the clearing remained silent, but I could feel those ancient eyes watching my departure. The message was clear. I was being allowed to leave with my life and sanity intact. But the privilege came with unspoken obligations. This encounter would remain between myself and the forest, a secret that belonged to shadows and legends rather than scientific journals or casual conversation. As I walked the hidden trail that led back toward familiar territory, I began to understand why certain areas of the Australian bush remained perpetually unexplored, why experienced hikers sometimes emerged from the forest with stories they refused to tell, and why Aboriginal peoples had always spoken of country with reverence that went far beyond mere environmental appreciation. The land itself held consciousness, ancient and patient, and utterly indifferent to human presumptions of dominance. The Yowie had granted me safe passage, but the gift carried implicit warning. There were boundaries in this world that existed beyond maps and fences. Territories claimed by intelligences that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, while remaining hidden in the depths of forests older than human memory. The path led me steadily eastward through forest that gradually began to show signs of human presence, distant power line cuts visible through the canopy, the faint sound of traffic carrying on morning air, the subtle geometric patterns that betrayed planted rather than naturally seeded trees. With each familiar landmark that emerged, the previous night's encounter took on an increasingly dreamlike quality, as if my rational mind was already beginning the process of rationalization and doubt that would eventually reduce the experience to something manageable. By mid-morning, I reached the fire trail where I'd parked my vehicle 2 days earlier. The dusty four-wheel drive sat exactly where I'd left it, covered in morning dew, and surrounded by the ordinary sounds of waking bush, kookaburras calling from nearby trees, the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth, the distant drone of an aircraft passing overhead. Everything appeared completely normal, yet I felt like an astronaut returning from deep space. Carrying memories of encounters that belonged to a different realm of existence, I loaded my pack into the vehicle and sat behind the wheel for several minutes, staring back toward the forest canopy that concealed whatever remained of my night in the deep bush. My hands, steady now in the familiar environment of civilization's edge, showed only minor scratches from yesterday's scramble through dense vegetation. My clothing bore the expected tears and stains from 2 days of hard hiking. Everything about my physical condition matched what anyone would expect from a challenging solo bushwalk. Yet I carried knowledge that transformed the entire experience into something unprecedented in my 20 years of exploring Australian wilderness. The drive back toward town provided time to consider what I would tell others about this expedition. Sarah would be expecting a call to confirm my safe return, and she'd naturally ask about highlights from the trip. My hiking group would want to hear about the route, the challenges, recommendations for future expeditions to the area. The local bushwalking club might request a presentation about accessing remote areas for their monthly meeting. All these ordinary social expectations suddenly seemed impossibly complex. How could I explain discovering tracks that led me deeper into forest than any marked trail, without mentioning the creature that made them? How could I describe becoming lost in familiar territory without acknowledging the intelligence that had orchestrated my disorientation? How could I account for 2 days in the bush without revealing the encounter that had fundamentally altered my understanding of what inhabited the deepest reaches of Australian wilderness? The rational part of my mind, reasserting itself as suburban streets replaced dirt roads, began constructing plausible alternatives to what I remembered. Perhaps the tracks had belonged to a large feral pig, distorted by soft ground, and my own inexperience with such signs. Maybe my circular wandering had resulted from simple navigation errors compounded by fatigue and stress. The sounds in the night could have been wind patterns unique to that particular valley, or the movement of nocturnal animals I'd failed to identify properly. Even the confrontation itself might have been a product of exhaustion and fear. A tall tree stump glimpsed through morning mist and transformed by an overwrought imagination into something far more dramatic. People had been creating monsters from shadows and uncertainty since the dawn of consciousness, and I had no immunity to such universal human tendencies. Yet these rational explanations felt hollow against the weight of what I'd experienced, the intelligence behind those ancient eyes, the deliberate arrangement of natural materials in the clearing, the precisely orchestrated guidance back to familiar territory. None of these details matched the random patterns of ordinary wilderness encounters. The experience possessed a coherence and intentionality that resisted reduction to simple misperception or psychological stress. More importantly, attempting to rationalize the encounter felt like a betrayal of something sacred. The Yowie had revealed itself not from aggression or accident, but as part of a carefully managed interaction, designed to establish boundaries and communicate truths about the nature of country that extended far beyond human understanding. To dismiss this revelation as delusion or misidentification would be to reject wisdom that had been offered at considerable risk to the creature's concealment. I realized that my decision about sharing this story would ultimately determine what kind of person I would become in the years following this experience. I could return to my ordinary life as an experienced bushwalker with interesting tales of challenging terrain and navigation difficulties, gradually allowing the memory to fade until it became just another adventure story, polished smooth by repetition. Or I could carry this secret as a private transformation, letting it inform my future relationship with wilderness, while respecting the boundaries that had been so carefully established. The Aboriginal peoples of this region had lived alongside such mysteries for tens of thousands of years, developing protocols and stories that acknowledge the presence of beings beyond ordinary human experience, while maintaining the discretion necessary to preserve both species. Their legends spoke of creatures that demanded respect rather than publicity, beings whose survival depended on remaining hidden from the destructive curiosity of modern civilization. Standing in their ancient footsteps, I began to understand that some knowledge carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal experience. The Yowie had trusted me with its reality, but that trust came with implicit obligations to protect, rather than exploit what I had learned. My silence would become part of the creature's camouflage. My discretion, a contribution to its continued survival in a world increasingly hostile to mysteries that could not be commodified or controlled. As I pulled into my driveway and saw Sarah's face appear in the kitchen window, I made my decision. This story would remain untold, at least in any form that might lead others to seek similar encounters. The forest would keep its secrets, and I would keep mine, carrying the memory as a private treasure rather than public revelation. I would tell Sarah about beautiful scenery and challenging terrain, about getting briefly turned around in unfamiliar country and spending an uncomfortable night listening to unusual animal sounds. All of this would be true, if incomplete. The hiking group would hear about the difficulties of navigation in unmarked wilderness, and the importance of respecting the unpredictable nature of remote Australian bush. But the deeper truth would remain between myself and the ancient intelligence that had chosen to reveal itself in that dawn clearing. Some boundaries, once acknowledged, became permanent features of the landscape of consciousness. I had been granted passage through a realm normally hidden from human awareness, and the privilege carried lifelong obligations that I was finally beginning to understand. The Yowie had returned me safely to the world of ordinary experience. But I would never again enter deep forest without awareness of what watched from shadows, beyond the reach of maps and scientific classification. That knowledge would change everything about future expeditions, adding layers of reverence and caution that had nothing to do with conventional wilderness safety, and everything to do with respecting the ancient protocols that governed encounters between species, separated by evolution but sharing the same country. Some stories, I realized, were meant to be lived rather than told. If you've ever walked deep into the old country and felt like you were being watched, you'll understand the silence that follows some encounters. Hit like and subscribe for more stories from the Australian bush, but remember, some things are better left undisturbed.